Hello and welcome to another of Keystone Tutors webinars. My name is Jenny McGowan. I'm Keystone's director in Asia. Have been based in Hong Kong for 8 years now and have worked with lots of students and parents who are moving across to the UK school system. And today we're going to talk about the 16 plus admissions process, thinking about how schools assess different applicants and then what the kind of preparation for that might look like. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about is specifically for kind of international families that are based outside of the UK, because at 16 plus, the process becomes quite a bit more kind of academic and based on curriculum, and therefore there can often be gaps between what students might be studying in their local or international schools outside of the UK. So I'm going to walk through that with you today using a kind of presentation with lots of information and example questions and things. If you have any questions at all, please pop them in the Zoom Q&A box, and I may well answer those as we go through. If not, I will come to any questions that there might be at the end, and I'll also send a follow-up email either later today or tomorrow that will contain this recording and any kind of links or resources that we might talk about. So let's get started. So just briefly, I wanted to run through the kind of UK educational roadmap. I appreciate some of you listening may be very familiar with this already, but just to make it very clear what we're talking about at 16 plus entry, and also what the term kind of sixth form means. Often these things are used interchangeably. So if we look towards the right hand side of this roadmap, from kind of year 10 in the UK, so the kind of yellow section on this map is where the kind of standardized national exams start to kick in. So many students will go to UK boarding schools in year 7 or year 9. And often there's a settling in period where, you know, you're getting to grips with what the UK system is, what subjects are being studied. Whereas actually once you go into year 10 or then into year 12, you're going into the 2-year GCSE programme or the 2-year A-level or IB system. So when we're talking about 16 plus entry, we're talking about going into year 12. So that is when you're kind of 16 and you're signing up really for 2 years at a UK school, and you're very likely to be doing A-levels or the IB. There are fewer schools that offer the IB compared to internationally, but they obviously do exist within the UK system. I guess the other key point on this map is the kind of applying to university purple pink kind of section on here, where actually you apply to university in the UK and for the US and elsewhere at the start of then year 13. So this process is quite rapid, and this actually informs a lot of the 16 plus admissions process, where schools really need you to be fairly ready to apply to university, whereas actually if you're going, let's say when you're age 13 into year 9, they have a lot longer with you to kind of form you into a good applicant and look at the potential that you have. Whereas actually when you're going into the sixth form, which is the 2 years of year 12 and 13 that are in the red here, actually it's a pretty quick process, and they don't actually have that long with you until you apply to university, and then you take your exams at the end of year 13. And that just changes a little bit what they're looking for at 16 plus. So an overview then of, I guess, what I'm kind of trying to get at here. So 16 plus is definitely highly competitive compared to the kind of younger year groups. And there are several reasons for that. So firstly is that not all schools open up new places at 16. So they will fill at 11 or 13. And often the only places available at 16 are for when students have left. So their current students are leaving, they will open up spots for new students into the sixth form based on how many students there are. And that could be a handful. There are some schools that might have single digit number of places year on year. There are some schools that open up and reserve a lot of places into the sixth form. So there are some schools that will have sixth form boarding houses where they may actually take in 50, 60, even 70, 80 students into the sixth form. And obviously that changes the competitiveness a little bit. And it's worth looking at these kind of things at sixth form to make a judgment on kind of which schools you should be looking at, because it can be very, very selective if there are only a few places available. As I've said already, the sixth form is fast paced, and that's partly because there's only 1 year until university applications. And so what schools are looking for are students that are ready to be able to deal with that fast pace and have an idea of, what they want to study, what they want to do at university, because ultimately that makes their job a little bit easier. If you're much clearer on what your plans are and you're clearly ready to deal with that, they've got less work to do, and they only have a year with you in terms of, getting you up to speed on subjects and A levels and IB choices. And therefore they are looking for students who are kind of academically more ready. Whereas if you are applying when you're 11 or 13 or 14, they know they have time. So there's an element of potential coming into play where they can see, okay, maybe the student needs a bit of work, but actually we like them a lot. And we think that we can get them to the point that is needed by the time they take their GCSEs or A levels or whatever. Whereas at 16 plus entry, they just don't have that time. And so the admissions process is definitely more academic in nature. And then when are these assessments? So they're normally 1 year before entry. So if you were planning to start in 2027, the admissions tests will all be this coming autumn. So often between October and November is when most of the schools are doing their testing. And it's worth bearing in mind that this process can be super tiring if you don't streamline how many schools you're applying to, because often the testing all happens within a couple of weeks of each other. And exam testing fatigue is for sure real. And so, what you don't want is to burn out through that process and then realize that actually your favorite school has its testing last, and by that point actually the student is fairly exhausted. So at 16 plus the testing is much more intense, and I'm going to talk about what that looks like, but there's just a lot more testing and a lot more exams than you would have when you're younger. And so managing that is important and not overloading with the number of schools that you choose. You can't kind of set it across a strategic timeline in the same way that you can do at the younger years. At 16 plus, they all seem to crash and all be very close together. So then briefly then about choosing, a school at 16 plus, just to kind of go through, I guess, some key considerations based on the fact that I've just said you should probably be a little bit more selective about the schools that you choose. So academic level is, again, important. This is important when you're younger as well, but it's more important at 16 plus, given that emphasis on how fast paced things are and how little time. They really are looking for students who are able to kind of hit the ground running, and therefore that academic level is important to match against what your child can do. There's less flexibility, there's less places available, and so trying to get the level correct in terms of the admissions process is important. And it also goes without saying that also, because it's very fast paced when you get there, if your child is then not quite able to keep up, that can then really damage the kind of academic outcomes and university places, which is probably the reason why you're considering going to the UK at 16 plus. And actually, if you get that level wrong, it can actually be quite a challenging experience once the student arrives. The other thing is then curriculum. So most schools in the UK offer A levels. That's the dominant curriculum. Kind of high 90% of students are taking A levels. That's also partly because the government schools only offer A levels, so that is the dominant curriculum that is offered. But there are obviously schools that offer the IB, there are schools that exclusively offer the IB, and there are schools that will do A levels and the IB, but you would be asked to indicate which of those you wanted to study when you registered. So Some schools are a bit flexible about that if you then wanted to change your mind later on. But when they're assessing you, they are doing that with the curriculum you have chosen in mind. So they might have given you a place on the basis that you've chosen the IB. And actually, if you switch to A levels, they might be oversubscribed or not have a spot for that. So it's much better to get that decision correct at the start. And you also need to check the actual subjects that are offered. And I think this is particularly important for the IB. Schools in, let's say, Hong Kong, Singapore, are true IB schools where normally they're offering the breadth of what the IB curriculum offers. Every student is taking it. The teachers are trained in all the subjects. In the UK, that's actually relatively uncommon. And so the number of subjects on offer can actually be quite restrictive. And that sometimes takes people by surprise, where they've got a very clear idea of which subjects they wanted to pick, but actually the schools that they're interested in don't offer that. So it's super important when you're choosing a school that if you have subjects that you really must study, like psychology, for example, is quite a common one that people really want to do. And actually in the UK, it's much less common to offer psychology. And that will then trip people up where they think they found the perfect school, but then they can't do the subject that they want. And the other point around here is around languages. So if you are a native speaker of a language and you're thinking about doing either an IB subject or an A level in that language, do double check that with the school, because again, they may have different rules around what that looks like compared to what schools in Asia might do. So just do your homework a little bit on subject choices before you fix on a school. Single sex or co-ed, I think in some ways is probably a dying conversation. There are so many co-ed schools now at 16 plus, even the kind of all boys schools. A lot of them are now having girls at 16 plus anyway. So it might be that actually the single sex option isn't necessarily available. But again, it is worth thinking about. I think, again, this is different at 16. I think, you're going into kind of maturity and thinking about university. And I think sometimes that can change parents' views on single sex versus co-ed. So again, just worth taking the age into account there compared to when they're younger. Boarding percentage, I think when you've got parents that are living halfway around the world is always very important to think about. But arguably it's less important, I think, at 16 plus than it might be when they're younger. When you're younger and you might be alone on the weekends and the school might be quite quiet, I think that's a much bigger problem. But actually at 16 plus, students tend on the weekends to be super busy with studying and reading and doing all the academic preparation for their schoolwork and also university applications. And so in some ways, I think it matters slightly less. But again, you need to think about your child there and what would suit them best and what type of environment they would thrive in. University support and results, I think at 16 plus is definitely something to look at. If you've got an idea of which country you want your child to go to, I think if you're aiming for the UK, obviously most UK boarding schools will be able to support with that and have a good level of preparation. But if you're looking at maybe the US or back in Hong Kong or Singapore, for example, it is definitely worth looking at the university results. So are students actually going to those places from the school? And just kind of working out what that level of support might look like, because again, a lot of schools are not set up for global applications. They're much more focused on UK applications. You might want to look at the kind of international community and makeup of the school. So again, the international percentages can be quite different. And even within the international percentages, where are those students coming from? And just making sure that you've got, a diverse, interesting community rather than potentially it kind of being concentrated in certain places. But again, that's personal preference. Some parents prefer one or the other, and it's just being aware of that before you start, I think is worth doing it. And then extracurriculars, I think, are always important. That's a lot of the reasons why parents are often interested in UK boarding schools. Again, there's less time in the sixth form for extracurriculars. It tends to be that you're much more focused on the academic side, but it is worth just considering whether certain sports or arts or drama is provided if your child has a particular interest. But most UK schools offer a pretty broad range of activities. It's more just if you need any specialist training or support, you might want to see if the school does actually offer that. So moving on to the assessments then. So how are students actually assessed at 16 plus? And I'm going to go through these kind of various different ways that they are assessed and talk about then what you can do to kind of prepare and maximise these different things. So I'm going to talk about school references that come from your current school, CVs and personal statements, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about screening tests. So often those are computerised tests at the start of the process, and then written papers, and then a little bit about interviews as well. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn, talk about what they look like, and then talk about what you can do to help prepare. And again, if there's any questions about anything that I said, do please pop that in the Q&A, and then I'll address those as and when they are relevant. Okay, so starting with the school reference. So pretty much every UK school will want to see information of some sort from the current school that the child is at. They don't all ask for the same thing. So some schools will actually want to see latest school reports. So things that the parents have received maybe in the past year, to kind of see what information is being shared with parents. But they may also, and this is more common, is that they will request a reference from the school directly. So when you register, you will put down the contact details for somebody at your current school that you want to then write a reference. At 16 plus, they may also ask for predicted grades for GCSEs. So if you are at a, let's say, British international school at the moment and you are taking GCSEs, those would be obviously relevant, and the UK schools fully understand that process, so they would want to see those grades. If you are taking alternative qualifications, so let's say in Singapore you are taking O-levels, again, they may ask for predicted grades. They understand these other systems slightly less, so you may need to provide context of the scoring system or how that works to make sure that they know what the grading looks like. If you're not taking any qualifications at 16, because you're in, let's say, a local school system in Hong Kong, or an American school, that's fine. It's not an expectation, but it is then worth having a discussion with the UK schools about what they would like to see, because UK schools do quite like standardized data, and so asking them what they would like to see is quite important. And the final obvious thing to say here is that it's important that you discuss this with your child's current school so that they know this is coming and they know like what to prepare, because otherwise they're going to get this reference request that they then don't know what to do with. They don't know what types of information the UK school is asking for, because often it's quite different to local school systems that are outside of the UK. And I know parents are often quite hesitant to do this. I have lots of conversations with parents where they worry about telling the current school that you're thinking about leaving. And I do understand that hesitancy, but ultimately that is a decision that you've made. And actually you need that reference to be as good as it can be, and it will only be better if you have that discussion about what would be included and what your plans are looking like. So that's super important that you do let them know at least to expect that. So then personal statements and CVs. So this is something that comes in at 16 plus that actually is much less common when you're younger. So if you have already applied for a younger age point and now you're considering 16 plus, this is something that might be a little bit different. So CVs might be requested. CVs are actually less common. There aren't many schools that ask for a CV, but the aim is just to see, overall what has the student been doing. At 16, there's going to be an expectation that you've probably been making better uses of your summers and you're doing things that are a little bit more proactive. And the point of a CV is that it obviously just updates the school on kind of what you've been doing. I also don't think it's a bad idea to be preparing these kind of things anyway, so that students aren't forgetting what they've done. A personal statement is much more common. So a personal statement essentially is a document where you're explaining kind of, why you want to come to the school, what you have chosen in terms of your subjects, for example. And so schools may provide guidance. So some schools give a very specific breakdown of what they want to see in a personal statement. It might even be in question format where they're asking for specific bits of information. It might be that it's done under exam conditions. There are some schools where actually writing a personal statement about yourself is part of the examination process, again, so that it can't be kind of drafted and edited and reviewed endlessly. But generally speaking, it's to give the school an idea of what the student has going on in their life and what their future plans might look like. Again, going back to this idea that they're more interested in your subject choices and your university plans, that helps them to know that this student is kind of mature and is thinking ahead. And that's kind of what a personal statement is designed to show. So what would the kind of tips here be in terms of preparation? So keeping records of kind of academic and extracurricular achievements, I think is a good habit to get into anyway, because you never quite know when you might need that type of information. But obviously these things then feed through into a personal statement. So if there are significant academic awards at school, or things like Olympiads or whatever that might be, these kind of things are useful to keep records of, so that then you can refer back to those obviously when you're writing something like a CV. So that would be something to think ahead if you're maybe a year or two before applying. I think then the other thing here is engaging with kind of super curricular materials and thinking about what you've done beyond school. Because I think in the personal statement, if you're asked about why you've chosen your A-level subjects, it is good to say, well, actually, I've chosen, biology because I've liked biology at GCSE, etc. I mean, those are kind of obvious reasons why you might have chosen biology at A-level. But actually, if you can then give reasons why you like biology beyond school and reference like a podcast that you've listened to, or some articles or some books that you've read, that really shows them that actually you have thought about biology, you're very sure that that is what you want to study. And if you can then ideally link that to a kind of university course or career, that's great. Not everybody can do that, and not everybody knows what they want to study at university, but evidencing that you've thought about it is essentially the important part of this process. And so engaging with your subjects beyond school is a great way to evidence your genuine interest. And again, I think that's a good thing to be doing anyway when it comes to university applications. Super curricular preparation is really important, and actually getting into the habit of doing that when you're a bit younger and keeping notes of what you're doing is a really good habit to get into anyway. But it also will help with your personal statement when it comes to being convincing about why you've chosen your subject, what your long-term plans might look like. And the students that have clearly done work outside of school on their subjects always stand out when it comes to a personal statement. So that would be the kind of top tips that I would give. But you also need to know what the format is and ask the schools you're applying to if there is a personal statement, and if there is, what's the format? Is it questions? What's the word count? And most of you'll be bound by what information they give you. But beyond that, you can be thinking about the types of information that you're looking at and reading. So then the next thing that might form part of the admissions process is some sort of computerised test. And again, these are very common at younger at entry points. 16 plus, there are fewer of them, I would say, but there are schools that still used a computerised kind of screening to assess the baseline of the applicants. It's a quick way for them to get a snapshot and level everybody and compare everybody, really, is kind of what they're using it for. And the reason why a lot of schools like these kind of computerised tests is that they're also testing potential rather than knowledge. So I've got some example questions I'm going to show you in a second, but it's often they're about reasoning and problem solving rather than knowledge recall. So it's not testing simply what you know. It's testing the way you think and your problem solving ability. And again, those are important skills when you're in sixth form, because the workload and things like that gets harder. It might be that for international students, if you're based outside of the UK, there might be some sort of English-based screening to test that the level of English is good enough to be able to access the curriculum. That could be something like the UK ISET, which is a test that has a very big English component to it, or it could be a separate type of English test that the school sets. Always double check that if you are a native English speaker. So, you know, if you're a family that has moved out of the UK but originally from the UK, or actually you're based in, let's say, Hong Kong, have been for a long time, but actually you are native English speakers, you speak English at home, schooling is done in English, ask the question about whether those international screening tests are needed. Often schools will waive them if actually you are a native English speaker. So always worth asking the question. And so just to give some very quick examples of the types of reasoning questions that come up in these tests. So in case people aren't familiar with this, they're not that dissimilar to like an IQ test that we might imagine adults taking. So verbal reasoning essentially is kind of problem solving with kind of words and kind of numbers, really. So again, you'll kind of see here that it's working things out from a series of codes, for example, on the bottom left hand side. So you're kind of having to work out which different letters represent different things. And again, obviously vocabulary and things help in this. If you know more words and you've got a good vocabulary, that's really helpful. But actually a lot of it is about problem solving and the context of where the word sits in a sentence, rather than necessarily testing your spelling or grammar. It's more about your kind of analysis of the questions. And then if we just look at non-verbal reasoning quickly, this again is problem solving, but not involving kind of words. So it's to do with pictures and images and trying to work out kind of what comes next. Or things like they might give a cube with patterns on it, and it's kind of, you know, what would the net of that cube look like? Or if I was to flip this shape, what would the other side look like? It's those kind of questions that are getting you to think about something that's abstract. So it's not just about what you've learned at school, it's actually you thinking about what that might be. So these are the types of questions that come up. And I guess the reality is with computerized testing, before I move on to written papers, is that they're harder in some ways to prepare for because they're not content specific. But there are lots of ways that you can practice online. There are testing platforms. And again, I can send you some examples of these in my follow-up email, where you can then practice these types of questions and just get familiar with them. You can't necessarily learn the content because there isn't a syllabus, but what you can definitely do is familiarize with the types of questions and speed as well. The idea of kind of working through questions quickly, you know, you can't go back and check. Things like that are potentially new to students sometimes if they're very used to taking tests at school where, you know, you're encouraged to go back, review, take your time. Actually, a computerized test is almost the opposite. You have to be quick and accurate and you can't go back again. And as a result, that's a slightly different format that students may need to get used to. So then moving on to written papers then, and this forms the bulk, I would say, of the 16 plus process. So some schools have a computerized test, not all. And even if they do have a computerized test, you know, it would be very rare that there are then not written papers that follow that. Now, the specifics here vary school by school in actually quite a significant way. More so than, again, if you're at 11 plus or 13 plus, where generally speaking, everybody is kind of using English and maths and that's about it. Actually, at 16 plus, they are much more interested in the ability that you have within the subjects that you want to study for A-level or IB. Often they do still use English and maths as a baseline, though. So a lot of schools will have some form of English and maths papers within their 16 plus process. So even if you're not planning to take maths for A-level or at IB higher level, you may still have to take a maths test. It will likely be an easier maths test than if you had chosen maths at A-level, but there often is still a component of that for English and maths, because it gives a good baseline. It gives a foundation for how well that student is doing. For A levels, so if you're picking A levels as your curriculum, there may then be exams in some of the chosen subjects that you want to study. So if you have picked, for example, history or physics, it is likely that they will test you in those subjects because they want to know that you are good at those subjects, given that, again, you're going to go straight into it. There's very little time to get you ready. And so often there will be subject-specific papers. Now, I think the challenge here is that not all students know exactly what subjects that they want to take. So it accelerates the need to make subject choices. So if you were staying, let's say, in your current school, you may be asked to make those choices halfway through year 11. Actually, if you're applying to UK schools, you kind of really need to know by the end of year 10, so that then over the summer you can prepare accordingly. There is always a little bit, again, flexibility. So if you change your subject choices after you've gone through the process, some schools will be flexible on that. But again, it depends on how similar the subjects are. I think specifically for STEM, so the kind of physics, maths, biology, chemistry, they really do want to see your ability in those subjects. So often if you haven't been tested in them and you want to switch, they may get you to do another test later on, even if you have a place to test your ability. Whereas within the humanities, there's often a bit more flexibility. So, if you've taken a test in, let's say, English literature, and now you want to switch to history, that they may allow that without extra testing. But again, it's better to get the subject choices as right as you can at the start, because it might not be possible to switch later. Even for timetabling reasons, it might be that actually they've got too many students that have picked physics, and actually they just can't accommodate you. So you do need to think through those subject choices. And those are conversations that I have with students and parents a lot, thinking ahead to university, what subjects, etc., are going to be relevant. So yeah, if you're in that position, we can definitely have a chat with you and help you with that. And then for the IB, often it's English and maths again as the baseline, and potentially one or two higher level subjects that you have chosen. So it's not dissimilar, but often they're more interested in your English and maths because you will actually have to study those regardless. You don't have a choice. But yeah, you still often are done. You're still then tested in another higher level subject that you have chosen. And then the other types of written papers that schools often use at 16 plus are general papers or kind of thinking skills type papers, which again are not necessarily curriculum based, but they are there designed to test and see how students think. And I've got some examples here, just to kind of give you an idea of what these look like. So one example on the left here is that students were given an article about a wildlife documentary filming team who basically rescued some penguins who were stuck in a ravine in the area that they were filming. And so students were given the article, and then the question is, why do you think there's a general rule amongst filmmakers not to interfere in what they're filming? Do you agree with the BBC crew's decision to break the rule in this case? So you can see here that that's not content based. There isn't really any prior knowledge needed to answer that question, and any prior knowledge should be in the article. But what they're looking for is a student's ability to reason and present an argument. So, you might present argument for why you think it was the right thing to do, why you think it's the wrong thing to do, and then ultimately conclude. So again, it's kind of analytical writing. That kind of thing is what they're looking for in these kind of general papers. And then on the right-hand side, again, you've got some kind of general essay questions at the top, which again have come up in general papers. And again, you'll see that they're not about content. They're giving the students an opportunity to kind of argue and discuss and show how well they can write. There are also sometimes logic questions within these general papers. So or even verging a little bit towards quantitative or scientific reasoning. So sometimes it might be maths or science type questions. But again, they tend to be quite abstract. So they're purposely kind of weird, let's say, settings, or the context is not quite what you would normally see at school. And again, it's testing that problem solving, taking the student out of their normal curriculum and looking at their ability to think and answer questions. So these are relatively common at 16 plus, because again, these types of skills are really important when you're doing A levels or IB generally, and for university applications. And so they play a role in the process, in addition to just drilling on exam content. So in terms of preparing for the written papers at 16 plus, this is where, again, for international students, it can be a little bit trickier, because most 16 plus exams are based on the GCSE curriculum. And that's because obviously the vast majority of students in the UK are taking GCSEs, and even internationally at British schools and things like that. So the tricky thing here is that if you're not taking GCSEs, or you are in a different curriculum, there's often quite a lot of gap filling and kind of bridging from one curriculum to the other to do. So, physics, for example, your child might be very good at physics, doing very well at physics at school, but it might be that there are topics that they've covered that aren't in the GCSE, and the other way around. There'll be topics in the GCSE that they haven't covered. So one thing that you need to do for this is look at what the GCSE curriculum kind of looks like. There are lots of different exam boards for GCSEs. It doesn't really matter which one you use. Edexcel is probably the kind of popular one, I would say, within UK independent schools. So if you just, put into your search engine, Edexcel physics GCSE syllabus and past papers, you will get lots of resources that will show you what's in the syllabus and what those types of questions look like. And that's the first big thing at 16 plus, is kind of matching what you've studied and what you haven't. And obviously that's more important for students that are not taking GCSEs. Even if you are taking GCSEs, I still think it's worth doing. Because again, the order might be different. And if you're applying for really competitive schools, it is likely that they push quite far ahead on what they're testing. So actually, it might be that you need to kind of get further ahead in the curriculum than your school is currently doing, because actually they may put the much more challenging GCSE questions in that you haven't necessarily studied before. And then, of course, we've got familiarisation with the exam papers. So again, if you're taking GCSEs, the papers are probably going to look more familiar to you. If you're not, though, the question style can be quite different. UK exams, I would say, are wordier than a lot of the testing that I see in schools in Asia. And what I mean by that is that they'll give a kind of abstract context that the question is situated in, rather than just giving you a fairly straightforward recall type question. So again, it's familiarization with that question style and working out what they're actually asking you to do. And then timing as well. Again, depending on what school system you're in, you may have taken lots and lots and lots of tests. It might be that actually taking tests under exam conditions is relatively new. And so again, that familiarization with, you've got 60 minutes, off you go, and practicing that, it is super important in addition to the content. Some schools will provide past papers for their 16 plus tests. Some of them even have them on their website, so you can access what they look like, and always ask the question. You can say, look, we're applying, these are our subject choices, would you be able to share past papers? They might not, but I would always ask the question just in case. But you can also use other schools' past papers. There are not huge differences between the 16 plus papers in many ways. And so, even if you're not applying to, I don't know, a certain school, if they have lots of papers on their website, I would use those. And actually being a flexible test taker is quite important, because there's nothing to say that a past paper from 2 years ago is actually what will be sat this year. So using a range of different schools' papers and GCSE papers is super helpful. I wouldn't be scared to deviate from your school's list. In fact, I would probably encourage looking at other schools to make sure that your child can confidently face whatever is put in front of them, rather than worrying that it doesn't quite look like the paper that they've seen before. There are, of course, then other types of exams or assessments that help with this. So like things like maths Olympiads, physics Olympiads, if you're doing those kind of competitions anyway, they are only going to help with your problem solving and thinking about the subject. And again, the very academically selective schools, their papers are particularly challenging in a way that like an Olympiad might be. And so actually practicing those kind of abstract questions can be really, really helpful to kind of get you ready for slightly more challenging questions than you might see in a GCSE paper. And there are also things like thinking skills assessment. There are certain like thinking or general type papers that help with that kind of logic and thinking that might come into some of the general papers at 16 plus. So there are kind of other exams as well, but beyond simply what the schools are providing at 16 plus, you can kind of engage with other exams and materials as well. Moving on to interviews then. So interviews at 16 plus, again, are slightly different to what happens at younger years. So in the younger years, it tends to be an interview about, extracurriculars and what you're reading and your hobbies and what you like about school. They're trying to kind of get the personality fit when you're younger, and make sure that you would be a good fit for the school and that you would contribute, etc. Because again, there's that idea that they have maybe 5 years with you, they've got longer to kind of mold you into the type of student that is going to be successful at the sixth form. Whereas actually at 16 plus, as I said earlier, they just don't have that time. So often there is a general interview where they are trying to get to know the student a little bit better, because obviously that is still important. I'm not saying they disregard that. But there's often then subject interviews at 16 plus, which is different. And that might be with the head of history or the head of physics. And again, the aim here is kind of, why have you chosen these subjects? What do you want to do when you leave school or at university? And again, that's where in some ways the prep that you've done for the personal statement can be quite helpful, because a lot of these are similar type questions. They're just being asked to you verbally instead of on paper. But it's more about your understanding of the subject and why you want to do it, rather than just a general interview about what you like and what you don't like. So the interview style can be slightly different at 16 plus, and it just has an academic edge. As with everything I've said so far, everything has a kind of a greater focus on academics at 16 plus, given that they want to know that you're able to cope with the curriculum and then be ready to apply to university relatively quickly. So in terms of preparing for interviews, a lot of this can be done around discussions at home, around reading, academic subjects, extracurriculars. So there are things that you can be doing as parents to discuss certain articles or things that maybe you've read. Like, for example, if you work in, let's say, law or finance, and actually your child wants to do economics for A-level, there are things that you can be sharing with them, or even articles that you could then discuss together. So there's quite a lot of discussion that can be done at home to help prepare for interviews, and also help students to think about whether they've made the right subject choices, things like that. All of this comes together to kind of help with making sure that they know what their future kind of looks like, and that they've made those right decisions in terms of what subjects that they would be looking at. And then beyond that, I think students can be watching, listening, news, current affairs, again, especially for subjects like economics or politics, or even some of the science subjects, where actually things can be relatively fast moving in the real world. Again, economics is an obvious one, where actually if you're not regularly engaging with, let's say, not necessarily The Economist, but material like that, then the school is going to think, well, hang on, how do you know you actually want to do that subject? So for some A-level IB choices, news and current affairs and keeping up with what's going on is super important. And then beyond that, same as what I said about the personal statement, engaging with super curricular materials. So again, listening to TED Talks, reading books about your topic. Again, then when you're at interview and you're asked why you want to study that particular A-level, you can give evidence of things that you've actually done. And it just convinces them that you really are sure you want to study that subject and you haven't just picked it because you had to choose it. You really are interested in it. And then, of course, the other part of interview preparation here would be, mock interviews and discussions with unknown kind of adults. So again, that could be friends or family that you have, or obviously at Keystone, we run lots and lots of mock interviews across all age groups every year. And so if you wanted your child to have a formal mock interview with someone that's unknown, with then kind of feedback and follow up on kind of what to work on, we can certainly organise that for you. And I think looking at that over the summer, when you've got a bit more time, is not a bad idea. As I said earlier, all of these assessments and interviews all end up kind of clashing and coming at the same time in the autumn. So waiting until you've actually been invited or what it is often can be a little bit late. And I actually think the summer is a good time for the kind of reading, the super curricular work, and then some mock interviews, because actually then the feedback will help inform the rest of the preparation. If you do it too late, there isn't really any time to then act on that feedback. And then, of course, the final thing in terms of preparation would obviously be kind of tutoring support. I think for students that are not in GCSE curriculum, ultimately what our tutors can do is work to bridge that gap. So looking at subject knowledge, looking at the question types, and some accountability as well. It's somebody that's overseeing this process academically and making sure that you're on board with what's going on. And I think when you're outside of a UK school setting, this is more important. Whereas if you're in a UK school already, which I appreciate some people listening may actually already have their children at UK boarding schools and maybe they're looking for a move at 16 plus, arguably you should be in a school that is doing GCSE work and helping anyway. But if, you may need some external support, because most schools obviously aren't going to prepare your child for 16 plus, because that's kind of counterintuitive. They want you to stay rather than leave. So it might be worth, thinking about some support anyway over the summer, just to make sure that the 16 plus exams in the autumn go as well as they possibly can. So that's kind of, I guess, the end of what I had to say in terms of the process. I hope that has kind of answered most questions. I can see that there are some questions in the Q&A that I think I've actually already answered, and I'll come to some of the others in a second. So if you have any other questions for me right now, do pop those in the Q&A and I'll work through them now. And of course, yes, we have lots of blogs and information on our website. I will send that out in the follow-up email, but please do get in touch if you wanted to discuss school choices or subject choices or anything that I've mentioned today. We guide many families through this every year. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now and just come to the questions. So as I say, do pop in any other questions that you've got. I think most of these I've answered. There is one here about SEN support for mainstream schools. I guess that, the context there, I suppose I'm unsure about in terms of exactly what your question might look like. Mainstream schools may imply even the state sector in the UK. So I'm not sure if that's what you're asking about or whether you are asking about independent schools. So the level of, generally speaking, the level of SEN support and what schools can help with will vary. So there will be some schools that, to be honest, offer very little. And if there is SEN need, they are likely to tell you that actually this is not the right school and actually you should consider someone else. A lot of UK schools are quite upfront about that. They don't want you to choose the school and then not be able to provide you with the right support. So I think UK schools generally are very upfront about what they can and can't do. You'll also be asked when you register if your child has any learning support, behavioural difficulties, any needs at all. And I would be as honest as you can there. Again, I know parents often think they should hide that, but that only ever backfires, because most schools will then see that there's a level of need within the admissions process and actually you haven't then declared it. So I think you should always declare any level of need that there is. And that's because you want the school to be able to support that student. There are then varying levels, as I say. There are schools that offer really quite significant levels of learning needs support, and if your child is in that group that may need quite significant help, there are definitely schools that are able to do that. And I would say that SEN support in UK is generally pretty good, but again, if you had any questions about the specifics of that in terms of which schools can support, that would, I guess, be a one-on-one conversation that we could have around the specific needs, because it varies quite a lot, again, depending on what that need might look like. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question. I'm not sure if it has, but hopefully that was useful. And I think the other questions actually I have already answered as I was talking. So I will wrap up there. Thank you all for joining. I will send out this recording and the links and any useful information probably tomorrow. And yeah, please do not hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or we can help with any part of the 16+ admissions process.